We are going to jump in and go ahead and bring up my stuff, Trudy. We're taking a look at chapter 5 of Daniel. We've just been marching through this, and the whole theme of walking through this is being change, is how do we within, knowing that we are a minority voice, and knowing that we are surrounded by, in one sense, though not quite the same, obviously, but we know we're the minority voice as the Jesus people in the world, and there are oppressive forces that are not friendly all the time to the ways of love and grace and dignity and all that. So the question that we're asking Daniel is, when you knew that you were in that minority space, how did you operate in the world to affect change? How did you do things differently and better, knowing that you were up against massive forces? And we've learned a lot over these few weeks. At least I have, and hopefully I've communicated what I've learned with you. And last week I just loved it, because here he's talking to King Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar had this horrible dream, and he speaks with grace and dignity to this guy who's caused so much pain, and he's saying, you know, it's not too late to turn it around. Bad things have happened under your watch, but it's not too late to turn it around. And I just love the fact that Daniel chose to speak with grace, and chose to speak with respect, even though there had to be parts of him that just wanted to lay into him. Well, let me give you some backstory before we jump into this story in Daniel 5. And it's deep backstory. So the Jewish people began with a guy named Abraham. Abraham had a bunch of, well, not a bunch of kids. He had two sons. One of them became the patriarch that would become the next one in line. The family spread, the family grew. There was this little thing that happened in Egypt and an exodus that followed that. After several centuries, somewhere around 1000 BC-ish, using very broad strokes, they decided to form a formal kingdom, and they became the nation of Israel. A guy named Saul was the first king, and by the way, that was not advised by God. God did not suggest that the people bring up a king, because what happens when you have one person, particularly a king, and give them essentially absolute power, is you can count on absolute corruption to happen as well. And that's what happened with Saul. He had some issues, and those things came out in a brazen way, and before you knew it, he was succeeded by King David, who was the favorite king in Israel's history. But David was a very colorful figure, to say the least, and he had lots of struggles in his life, and it was not a pretty picture. His son Solomon became the king after that, who was not the king that was supposed, or not the son who was supposed to become king, and it ticked off his oldest son Absalom, who wanted to kill David so that Absalom could become king. This is the family dynamic. Imagine that Thanksgiving dinner, right? Not a good experience. Well, after Solomon was king, he did bring the country into great wealth and riches, but he made a lot of mistakes, which weakened the infrastructure of the country. And because of Solomon's mistake, even though he was supposedly the wisest man that ever lived up to that time, the kingdom divided not long after. And you had a kingdom to the north called Israel, and that went up to like the Sea of Galilee area. And then you had the kingdom of Judah to the south, all still the same people, but the tribes separated. Judah included Jerusalem. Over time, foreign powers came and took over. First, the northern kingdom wiped them out, and then they eventually came in and took over the southern kingdom as well, under King Nebuchadnezzar. When Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to Jerusalem, usually what that was going to mean some starvation and eventual bloodshed, and then leveling the city and its temple, which is what Nebuchadnezzar did. And when Nebuchadnezzar did that, he took the key people, the leaders of Jerusalem, if they were still alive, and he pushed them into exile. So the only people who were left behind in the country were very poor people who would never be able to rally up in resistance to the empire. So that's the story. When the king would wipe out a city, particularly capital city, which is what Jerusalem was, they would also take its wealth with them. So they would raid the treasury, and in this case, the treasury was in the temple. So they cleared it out. There was nothing of great value left, and they put it in their own treasury in Babylon. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, he eventually died. He ruled for some time. And we're catching up now in a story. Applause for Nebuchadnezzar dying. Thank you, Lisa. That's fantastic. I never would have guessed that, but okay. So anyway, Nebuchadnezzar's been dead for a while, and the spoils of war from Jerusalem are still in Babylon's treasury, including some of these sacred objects from the temple, sacred objects that were only to be used for acts of worship in the Jewish tradition, only handled by the high priest within that faith because they were deemed so sacred. So that's some backstory to what's happening. And I'm not giving you the text today. I'm just going to read you the story like I did last week. And so get comfortable, because here is the story. In fact, you're going to recognize the Genesis. In fact, I'm calling this, well, you'll see this in your own Bible if you turn to it, but it's called the writing on the wall. You ever heard that statement? And you hear that especially in political field, the writings on the wall. Well, it comes from this story. And so you're going to hear the context of it today. So many years later, King Belshazzar gave a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he drank wine with them. So this is long after Nebuchadnezzar is dead. Well, not too far after Nebuchadnezzar was dead. And I just want you to think about that for a moment. 1,000 of his nobles. Lynn and I were functionally empty nesters for most of the year until our kids come back in the summer. And honestly, it's a little embarrassing if you were to come to our house during the school year. Because if you went into our refrigerator, you would laugh out loud, because there's nothing in it but eggs. That's it. And if you open the freezer, you would see our stockpile of Costco cauliflower crusted pizzas that we eat on a regular basis. Or maybe there'd be some cheese in the refrigerator that we would eat with some crackers for dinner, because we're just that lazy, and that's just the way it works. And I was remarking, we got all of our Thanksgiving shopping done yesterday, so we wouldn't have to go out with all the craziness in the days ahead. And we usually spend on groceries maybe $120, $150 a month. And now on this one flippin' meal, we're dropping 2 bills on this. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is insane. But the kids are coming home and they'll be well fed. So that's nice. So I want you to think about the size, and that's for 4 of us, right? I mean, it's a little bit ridiculous. Now I want you to think what it would take to feed 1,000 people. If you're going to throw a feast for 1,000 people, we're not talking, paper plates here. This is a king's feast. So this guy's going to drop some coin on this, and he has it to drop for 1,000 people. Can you just imagine what that could possibly look like and how lavish that must have been for this guy? That's a lot of people to feed. That's a lot of extravagance. And I just want you to hold on to that for a while. Just think about what that would look like, because that's a very important part of the story. While Belshazzar was drinking the wine with the crowd, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver cups that his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. He wanted to drink from them with his nobles, his wives, and his concubines. So they brought these gold cups taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. While they drank from them, they praised their idols made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, let me tell you about a couple things that are happening right now in this story that we might not see otherwise. First, the feast. When he's throwing a feast for this many people, you know what he's doing? The king is showing off. He's saying to all the people, yeah, I got enough money to throw a massive feast for 1,000 people. I am that rich. In fact, it's not even going to faze me. I could have these every day of the week if I wanted to. I am that powerful. So the feast itself is a statement of power and authority from the king. And then when they raid his treasury of some of these sacred objects from the temple, it's another statement of power. Now, the Jerusalem and the Jewish temple, they didn't have any images of God, because the Jewish tradition doesn't allow images of God. But they had sacred objects that were used in worship to God. When Belshazzar is stealing or using these stolen sacred objects in very casual use, he's desecrating them. He's challenging their sacredness. And again, he's saying to the world, and everybody's watching him drink from these cups, he's saying, those suckers thought they had a God that had some kind of power. I'm telling you, their gods are powerless compared to ours, because I am drinking from their God's cups. You see? So he's challenging the theology of the people, and he's flexing his muscle with the wealth that he's distributing with this affair. So that's the context of the story. Suddenly, they saw the fingers of a human hand writing on the plaster wall of the king's palace near the lampstand. The king himself saw the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale with fright. His knees knocked together in fear, and his legs gave way beneath him. The king shouted for the enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers to be brought before him. He said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever can read this writing and tell me what it means will be dressed in purple robes of royal honor and will have a gold chain placed around his neck. He will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom. But when all the king's wise men had come in, none of them could read the writing or tell him what it meant. So the king grew even more alarmed, and his face turned pale. His nobles, too, were shaken. But when the queen mother heard what was happening, she hurried to the banquet hall. She said to Belshazzar, "Long live the king! Don't be so pale and frightened. There is a man in your kingdom who has within him the spirit of the holy gods. During Nebuchadnezzar's reign, this man was found to have insight, understanding, and wisdom like that of the gods. Your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief over all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers of Babylon. This man Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, has exceptional ability and is filled with divine knowledge and understanding. He can interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." Now, every Jewish person everywhere who's retelling this story is like, "That's right. That's right. All those other chumps, they couldn't come up with anything, but our Daniel, he is the one who's known for doing this stuff." So Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king asked him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles brought from Judah by my predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar? I have heard that you have the spirit of the gods within you and that you are filled with insight, understanding, and wisdom. My wise men and enchanters have tried to read the words on the wall and tell me their meaning, but they cannot do it. I am told that you can give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read these words and tell me their meaning, you will be clothed in purple robes of royal honor and you will have a gold chain placed around your neck. You will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Daniel answered the king, "Keep your gifts or give them to someone else, but I will tell you what the writing means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave sovereignty, majesty, glory, and honor to your predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar. He made him so great that the people of all races and nations and languages trembled before him in fear. He killed those he wanted to kill and spared those he wanted to spare. He honored those he wanted to honor and disgraced those he wanted to disgrace. But when his heart and mind were puffed up with arrogance, he was brought down from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from human society. He was given the mind of a wild animal, and he lived among the wild donkeys. He ate grass like a cow, and he was drenched with the dew of heaven until he learned that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of the world and appoints anyone he desires to rule over them." Now, just a point of nerdy notes here. This is an example where we recognize that there is a theological perspective written in the book of Daniel. One of many different theological perspectives in the whole Bible. This is one of these points where I'm recognizing the theology of the writer of Daniel to suggest that the leaders in power all over the world somehow are almost like pieces of chess put on the board by God's self. That's kind of what Daniel's saying here. I don't agree with that theology. And it's okay to not agree with the theology. It's okay. This is their perspective then. I don't think that's the case. The reason why I don't think that's the case is simply because of the character and nature of God, which we talked about in the God Can't series. if it's true that God placed Nebuchadnezzar in power, that means that God was also behind all the horrible, horrible acts against humanity that were exacted by Nebuchadnezzar, including the present exile. I simply don't believe that's how God works. So anyway, that's just a little license for you to have the conversation with the Bible and the people of the Bible and wonder yourself, well, what do I think about this and how do I view it? But the story is still there, and that's how Daniel saw it, so we respect where he's at. So the story continues after he said what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel says to the king, "You are his successor, Nebuchadnezzar's successor, O Belshazzar, and you knew all this, yet you have not humbled yourself. For you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven and have had these cups from his temple brought before you. You and your nobles and your wives and concubines have been drinking wine from them while praising gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, gods that neither see nor hear nor know anything at all. But you have not honored the God who gives you the breath of life and controls your destiny. So God has sent this hand to write this message. This is the message that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, and parsin. This is what these words mean. Mene means numbered. God has numbered the days of your reign and has brought it to an end. Tekel means weighed. You have been weighed on the balances and have not measured up. Parsin means divided. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. These are accounting terms that showed up on the wall. And actually, people who heard these words knew what the words meant. They didn't know how to interpret them. Essentially, what God was doing at that moment and at the peak of Belshazzar's arrogance is, by the Spirit of God, somehow in this story, a balance sheet is laid out for the king. And it's basically saying, these numbers do not add up, and it's time to make a change. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was dressed in purple robes, a gold chain was hung around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, was killed. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So that is the story of the writing on the wall. You ever heard of the author Yvonne Ball? She was kind of an amateur author in the United States. She died in the 1990s, and she was pretty well known for some of her aphorisms. These are a few of them. This is good. Most of us ask for advice when we know the answer, but we want a different one. Knowledge is power, but enthusiasm pulls the switch. Oh, that's right. I love this. Nothing makes your sense of humor disappear faster than having someone ask where it is. Oh, this is good. The past should be a springboard, not a hammock. It's good. Ever notice that people say it's only a game when they're winning? Right? Oh, this is really true. A good marriage is like a good trade. Each thinks he got the better deal. Isn't that nice? That's true. These days, the wages of sin depend on what kind of deal you make with the publisher. That's true. The next one, a politician is a person who can make waves and then make you think he's the only one who can save the ship. That's true. And here's the final one. In fact, it's on the next screen. Most of us can read the writing on the wall. We just assume it's addressed to someone else. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to turn to somebody around you, if there's somebody around you. I want you to say, this is addressed to you. Okay, just say it. This is addressed to you. Excellent. Good job. So two things have happened now, much to your joy, I'm sure. One is you've been able to sustain your denial that this is not addressed to me, and yet at the same time, you've had lots of people tell you this is addressed to you. And so I want to talk about the writing on the wall in this story, because obviously it was addressed to King Belshazzar, and yet I think there's great application for our lives today that I want to talk about. And so on the next screen, I asked the question about honoring and handling the sacred. In this balance sheet thing of the writing on the wall, the question I want to ask and have us ask is, how do we handle the sacred? How do we handle the sacred? There are really two violations that happened, two mishandling situations of the sacred in this story. And the first one, quite honestly, escapes us because of where we live. And it's the fact that the king threw a feast for 1,000 of his nobles. You and I, we look for the most part, we all have times in our life probably where we have more than less or less than more, and it kind of ebbs and flows like that. But at this time of year, a lot of people are able to have a feast, something like that in the picture. And that's just part of our culture now. This is what we do. But what we fail to realize, and we know this, is that at this moment, right now, something like 2 billion people in the world, if not more, are extremely hungry, like not going to eat today, like not sure how many times they're going to eat this week. And Thanksgiving for them isn't, because there's no feast. It's not going to happen. The reason why it was such an offense for the king to have this feast for 1,000 of his nobles is because there were tens of thousands of people in his kingdom who he essentially robbed, who he took away and enslaved in his own place, who were struggling to have anything. And they're watching this guy waste their treasure on his royalty. It was an offense against humanity that every poor person felt, because they recognized that all the luxury that went into that one feast meant that much less for everybody else. And if you are a Jewish person in exile, you are one of those poorest of the poor, who is living in extreme poverty, who has very little, and the hint of living at that level of luxury makes you ill and makes you angry because you recognize the injustice. And this is a tension you and I have to hold. This, how do we deal with the sacred nature of our humanity? And on the one hand, and I'm not wanting to ruin your Thanksgiving at all, so you can relax on that. It's still a safe place. Because it is good to come together. It's good to bring friends, family together. And it's good to do it around food. And it's good to share love with each other and create memories and have a feast to celebrate. That's a good thing. But if it's only just about us, like King Belshazzar did, and it's only about look at us and look at our wealth and how good we feel about our wonderful position in the world, without any attention at all to the way the overwhelming rest of the world lives, that is a violation of something sacred. That is a violation of the sacredness of humanity itself. Now, we can feel somewhat good about this because we can feel okay in our tension, because last Sunday we feasted. And we had amazing food cooked by our amazing team of people, and we had auction stuff to buy. And for our, quickly put together thing, we raised $8,000 to help kids in Africa and help people right here in Napa. That's awesome. We can feel great about that. And the other piece is you don't have to stop feeling great. Or maybe you didn't get to the feast, and so you're feeling terribly guilty now, knowing you're going to have a feast on Thursday. Great news. Our website is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there's a little easy tab that you can give to these same things anytime you want. And actually, I would invite you to make that part of your tradition. Seriously. Improve your Thanksgiving. Improve your feast by taking a moment to just recognize that this whole thing of ours is a gift. Very few of you, if any of you here today, chose to be born where you are, chose to be living right here. It was chosen for you. We are living in the superpower. where we have great freedom and great resources. That's a wonderful luxury to enjoy. But I'm wondering, as you are in there, as Jesus people, as faith people, recognizing the sacredness of humanity everywhere, and particularly when we're feasting, to think about those who aren't, maybe make a moment, take a pause, and just say, you know what? It's easy to take this for granted. It's easy to be wasteful because of where we live. But let's just take a minute and truly be grateful for what we have here. Because this is a feast. This is a feast. And let's take it another step and just, in our gratitude, let our gratitude overflow into action. And maybe this week, maybe around the table, you can tell the story of how you know an organization that, not as a plug, not as a commercial, but as an opportunity for people to, in that moment, share the love. Wouldn't that balance things out in a kind of a cool way? So you figure out what to do with your feast this Thursday, but recognize the tension that we live with, because it's a tension. So that's the sacred thing, number one, that is easily missed on us because we are so used. We are so familiar and comfortable. We are so at home in the luxury that we experience in the United States. And let's talk about sacred objects. Because that's one that we can think to ourselves like, oh, whew, good thing I don't have any stolen golden and silver cups that I was thinking of using for dinner this Thursday night. Off the hook. Well, let's talk about other sacred objects. Let's talk about the sacred holiday, the sacredness of the holiday itself. So I'm old enough to remember when times were a little different at Thanksgiving. Times that my kids know nothing about, actually. I remember when Thanksgiving Day would roll around, there wasn't a lot on TV. There might be, my high school years I lived in Michigan, and Detroit Lions always play on Thanksgiving Day. So there was the one game to watch, and maybe one or two others. There would be some movies that to get you in the holiday spirit that would show up in the evening to kind of kick off the Christmas season. People would begin shopping on Friday, but there was none of this thing about Black Friday starting on October 15. You know what I mean? Let alone on Thanksgiving Day, where it's a rush to get through your Thanksgiving meal so that you can be first in line to get that extra $50 off the TV at Walmart or something. Times have changed. The sacredness of the meal itself has changed. At least in our American mythology, the way we like to think about it is our earliest settlers here had a feast to celebrate that they got through their first year and wanted to just come together and join hands and just celebrate that, we made it through our first year together. At least that's how we like to picture it. And really, in our best sense, that's what we want to do today. So I'm just wondering, how have you kept sacred boundaries around that day? And if you've let them slide, how can you bring them back so that the holiday itself might be once more sacred? And it can be that place for actual love, actual community, actual thanksgiving. How are you going to do that? Because if you're not paying attention, it'll slide. And it'll just be another day to celebrate consumerism in the United States. There are other sacred things that we may not even be aware that we violated. In our country, we have this little thing called the Constitution. And a friend of mine gave me a copy of the Constitution. I don't think I'd read it since high school or college or somewhere in there. And all of a sudden, I was given a booklet. And one camping trip, I decided I'd read it. And so I read the thing, and you know what? There was a part of the Constitution I never knew was in there. And it has to do with something that we as Americans have grown very, very comfortable desecrating, violating the Constitution. You know what it is? It has to do with the American flag. There's a part of our Constitution that states very clearly that we are not to commercialize the American flag, to protect its sacredness. And yet I know that every year, somewhere in June, Old Navy will come out with this year's version of their American flag t-shirt to make $1 gazillion for their company. And we will come to our festivities, because we almost always hold a picnic after church around that time of year. And some of you, Donna Randall, look incredible in all of your regalia. Or Trudy Boucher, former teacher, has all the gear, and it is a living, breathing American flag. I mean, it's really something. And I'm kind of making fun of it. But in a weird way, when we do that, we kind of forget the sacredness of it. Because there are real rules about how to treat it, what to do with it when you're bringing it down. And Lynn and I are big Disneyland junkies, and one of the beautiful things they do every day is they have a flag lowering ceremony with their band, and they honor veterans. It is chilling to experience that. They remember the reverence with that. That's a casual example. And then the funny thing is then we get upset when we see people actually acting out in ways that are supporting what the flag represents in terms of freedom for all people. And we get up in arms about seeing people do things in the name of the flag while we're wearing our American t-shirts, our American flag t-shirts. It's a strange tension, but it's something to think about. Another one, this is kind of an easy one. It's a horrible one, but it has to do with the internet and the information age that really is still a very new thing for humanity. Again, I'm old enough to know when that thing actually started and became a thing. And one of the horrible things, I think the internet in itself is benign, but as a tool, it can be used for incredible good and incredible evil. And one of those incredible evils has to do with pornography. Which has become such a pervasive part of culture. We don't even think about it. It's just like, people are into it or they're not into it. And you can, turn on the radio and it's just treated so incredibly casually. Like, I'm just not really into porn. Some people are, that's okay, whatever. And we forget what's being communicated with this. Because we're all sacred. Every one of us, we're sacred beings. And even if we tell ourselves this anyway, somebody wants to display every nook and cranny of their sacredness as their choice, that doesn't really mean that it's okay for us to have our eyes on their sacredness. Does that make any sense? It's like we devalue the other's sacredness even if they're willing to devalue it themselves. The Jewish people and their tradition of wedding ceremonies, they hold a wedding. The bride and groom are under a chuppah, and the chuppah represents the bed chamber, the bedroom. And the idea of the chuppah is it is for the couple getting married. It is for them. No, there aren't supposed to be any other eyes under the chuppah, because it protects the sacredness of the person. And so if this is something that you've messed with or thought about, there is a great theological reason why we need to be on guard with this. And it's because, as pervasive as it is and as culturally accepted as it is even, that doesn't mean it's all right. Because there's a sacredness to what is being displayed that we need to honor even if the people behind it can't or won't. But there are other things that we can think about. Social media is one of these sacred things that we don't think about. We have the capacity now to anonymously say anything we want about anyone, anywhere, and get away with it. And it's shown some of our true tendencies and our true colors. And it's disturbing because we think we can just get away with stuff. But again, it calls into question what is sacred and what is not. And how are we choosing to treat people? And we know that our own social media has, for at least our intelligence agency, has now been weaponized against our own country, that it can actually do great harm. I thought one of the fascinating things that's come out, about what our own Secret Service is saying is that the foreign governments that have used social media, at least in the reports that we've got, they didn't really care which candidate was going to win. They just wanted to disrupt, which should tell us something about ourselves, about our capacity to be disrupted, our capacity to find ourselves in the mess. I've shared it before. I had this farmer back in the Midwest in my first church, and he used to say to me, "Pastor Pete, never mud wrestle with a pig, because you'll both get muddy and the pig likes it." And so I'm wondering, in our social media, how do we consider the sacred, particularly with our language, with what we represent, with what we say? And that extends to the sacredness of the people that are going to be around our tables at Thanksgiving. How are we with our attitude, our tone, our body language? How are we bringing a sacredness back to this thing, a dignity that needs to be there? Because it is a choice, and it's something that we can do. In fact, I would say that it is maybe our great challenge this week as we head into Thanksgiving. Because here's what might happen. You might get to Thanksgiving dinner, and Larry right there, he's going to be upset about something because his football dream fantasy whatever isn't working out the way he thought, and he knows it's all a bust. And so he's just coming in hot to Thanksgiving dinner because he looks at me and he knows that I generally root for the Kansas City Chiefs first and the San Francisco 49ers second, and maybe on a bad day the Raiders. And he's a Raiders fan, and so he's just going all, and he knows he's going to see me there, and so he can't help himself. And so he just comes sideways into me, comparing quarterbacks and plays and bad calls and blah, blah, blah. Because, you know, like Larry does all the time, he's always whining about something. By the way, I can only say this because I love Larry and respect Larry. Larry's a wonderful guy. All right, so anyway, I have a choice at this point at this dinner party. What am I going to do with Larry coming sideways? The lizard brain in me is going to say, forget sacred, forget whatever. I don't even know what who's Pastor Pete anyway? And so you're going to forget all that because your lizard brain is going to take over, and it's just going to be, game on, man. Let's go. You're going to mess with my Mahomes. You got something to talk about. So that would be a normal, natural way for us to do it. But what if we could pause? What if we could even prepare? What if we could, in our mind, practice even ahead of time? Because we know what the dynamics are going to be. We know that sometimes the family dynamics are very tense. And so what if I know that I'm gonna come across Larry and he's gonna be ticked because it's not going his way? And what if I prepare ahead of time for that conversation so that when Larry comes sideways at me, I don't go sideways back, but I think about what does sacred look like? What does it mean for me as a sacred person to speak to Larry, another sacred person? Because some of the things that Larry's going to say to me in that exchange may be very personal. They may be attacking. They may be innuendo, just a word here and there that attacks my character. And it's going to make me wonder, is that true? It's going to challenge my self-worth. And if my self-worth is that small and that fragile, then it's a better shot that I'm going to defend myself and come right back after Larry. Because that's what we do. But then I have a choice. And if I think about it, practice it ahead of time, maybe I have a choice to actually live out of my sacredness. And knowing that I'm going to see it, knowing that Larry's going to, let loose on me, I can say to myself, okay, Larry's going to say he's going to stir it up, man. But I'm not going to own it. Because I know who I am as a child of God. That God has already decided my worth, my value, and it's very high. My self-worth is on solid ground, and it's not dependent on Larry's fantasy football league. And so therefore, because I know my value's there, whatever he's shooting at me of whatever flavor, I can let that roll, because it's just not true. And furthermore, even though there's a part of me that just wants to lay right back into Larry, I don't have to. Because I can recognize within him his sacred nature. In fact, I can even choose my words carefully to woo that out of Larry, because I wonder what's happened to Larry, that he's not acting out of his sacredness, but instead is acting out of his lizard brain. And so it becomes a great opportunity for us to change the air in the room. It's an easy thing. Well, it's not an easy thing. It's a simple thing. But it's something that we can figure out how to do. And kind of a final thing to think about, just as a super practical thing, to exercise your sacredness, which is what you are. You are sacred. You are very good, created in the image of God. It doesn't mean you're perfect. We all make mistakes, but our core identity is we are people of God. God breathed, made in the image of God. That's the core part of our story. And so we got to build on that. So another sacred thing that I think we struggle with in our culture, partly because of these beauties. Well, first, free tip number one, maybe have a basket for phones. And then put that basket in a safe that only you know the combo to, and say we're going to take a 4-hour break from our phones and just see what happens. But the bigger sacred thing has to do with how we converse. And I was talking about this exchange with Larry. Well, let's say Bruce over here. Let's say he wants to have a conversation. You know how a lot of conversations go in our culture? Bruce will start going on and on about whatever he wants to tell me about. And if I'm in a normal, very common conversation in our culture, you know what I'll be doing while he's sitting there telling me about whatever he's talking about? Paying no attention at all. I couldn't care less about what Bruce is saying because I'm concentrating on what I'm going to say in response to Bruce's boring story. Right? No offense, Bruce. I love you, man. Another guy that I think is a great guy. This is what we do. This is just how it is. And I know you know that this is true. I know that you know that we suck at listening. And so my thing that I'm going to encourage you to do as an act of seeding the sacred, so that, because the writing is on the wall and it's got your address on it for this, is to sow in the sacredness of other people by actually listening. I mean, really listening. You have no idea what you're going to say next. I just want to hear all about Bruce's trip or whatever ventures he's into next, and be curious. Because I think in our hyperactive, easily distracted culture, we don't have too many people that actually slow down and listen. It's hard to do. It is not a thing that is practiced in our culture. And I'm asking you, as people of God, I'm encouraging you that one way you can instill sacredness with those around you is to value their sacredness by actually caring about what they say. Listening, asking questions, being curious. Such a simple but beautiful thing to do. You know what I think will happen if we start doing this more and more? I think the fresh winds of the Spirit of God, which are constantly wanting to restore and renew and bring back the sacred, which is all around us all the time, I actually think it will start to happen more. And I think instead of being, caricaturized as judgmental jerks, as people of faith, what if we could change that because we're choosing to enter as sacred people into sacred people and sacred creation and treat it like that? How beautiful would that be? What a different opportunity we have this Thanksgiving to actually turbocharge our capacity for Thanksgiving because we are recognizing the sacred around us, which is so worthy of giving thanks. That's our challenge today. On the next slide, just to remember, most of us can read the writing on the wall. We just assume it's addressed to someone else, but I'm telling you, it's addressed to you. And what a gift. What a gift for us to ask the questions about sacred things and what we're going to do with them. Let's pray together. So God, as we enter this week, this week where we do a very, very sacred thing of giving thanks, may we truly pause and really recognize what we have to be thankful for. May we thank your Spirit, your presence, because you are the giver of good gifts. You are the source of life. You are the source of love and joy and peace. And so we choose even now to give thanks ahead, and we ask for your help to open our eyes that we would see just how much there is. And I pray, God, that we will be agents of the sacred, that we'll recognize our identity as your kids who are forever loved and therefore of great inherent value to build a life on. And I pray that we'll walk around in great humility with that identity, and that we'll start to call out with the help of your Spirit the sacredness of everyone we meet, especially around the table. May this be an incredible Thanksgiving, God, because we've recognized the sanctity and the sacredness that is there. And we'll give you the thanks for the beauty that happens. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you so much for coming today. We hope you had a good experience. If you got any feedback for us or support, please put those in the little buckets on the table, and we will see you the next time we see you. Thanks a lot.